I was asked to share a little bit about some of the successes that ALMA has, and more specifically, some of the projects that we're involved in. Western, as Gordon mentions, has a G&D, Growth and Development Department, and at last count we have 9 projects underway in technology, in market research and development, in production systems, in food safety. We sponsor students, a number of different initiatives that all are designed to bring home a commercial application at some point in time. But today's talk is focused specifically on the information section project that we have that we'll speak about in a few minutes. And I've taken the liberty to change the title of the topic. I was given the challenge to speak about a new model for information sharing in the beef industry. And I think you can't talk about sharing if you don't have some dimension of use as part of that discussion. So I'll get into my presentation. I'm going to try to be brisk and brief because I know we've got a long agenda, but let's work our way through it. So what's information all about? You have to start by collecting information, processing information, utilizing that information, sharing that information, processing it again with your shared partners, and utilizing that shared information again. And I think this is the fundamental principle that we hear about in the beef industry as carcass quality or feedback loops or strategic alliances all become common language. But we have to also discuss the concept of how do you turn data into results. And not many people understand that you start with measures, the appropriate measures. You really got to spend a lot of time on the measures before you get to data, information, extracting knowledge from information, developing a strategy, implementation of strategy, looking at the results of that implementation, and an assessment, and starting over again. I think we all know this, but I reinforce it because it isn't the information that's the critical component. We find over and over again it's the components on the periphery that really are important. We can have knowledge, but if we don't use it or apply it appropriately, it's really not that valuable. And I think that's the matrix that the commercial industry works in that unfortunately those in the research community find themselves challenged. They don't have the multiple perspectives or parameters of how information is collected and what's valuable and how is it assessed from a value standpoint. So today, going to talk a little bit about animal information. Animal ID and animal management, we're going to fly through that. We're going to talk a little bit about economics and why economics are important. Some of us believe it is. And we'll conclude with a discussion on a new paradigm in animal management. Long before any other identification systems came up, we had one in the cattle industry. Either that or these guys are having a giant fondue. Irregardless, branding was well known as being the key component, and the way we registered and identified brands was all over the map. And there's all kinds of lists of organizations, groups, entities that use brand identification. But the industry has become more complex, and we see multi-dimensional layers of users of cattle, producers of livestock, purveyors of beef. And as we've heard all morning, the quality component is starting to transcend the individual sectors and starting to become a value proposition. We've been involved in value-based marketing for upwards of 17 years. And basically that, in our circumstance, relates to us using a pricing matrix, which is based on quality parameters of the carcass that establishes the final price. Immediately that drives us to the sensitivities of the packer as to how he gets value out of his product and thereby affixes value components to that carcass, which he translates to a pricing matrix to us. And it also puts us in a position where we're very interested in the quality components or the potential for quality in the feeder cattle that we source, not to mention the feeds and the various other factors. So the industry has become much more complex, and the traditional identification system has had to undergo a little bit of a revamping. The traditional brand system or tattoo system just isn't valid anymore, and we've had to develop other means and mechanisms. And along came our ear tagging system, which was wonderful. I mean, we could dangle these calves, dangle a tag on these calves, identify them by eyesight. Certainly they'd carry a brand for the traditional, but we'd have an identification system. And Lord knows, it had implications. we started branding or tagging everything from chipmunks, food, even our, oh, did I miss it? Even our friends. We tag them as well. So, in our own system, as we've developed our new tagging systems, you'll see there's been various amounts of information you could plug onto these tags. I particularly like in the top left-hand corner, those cattle must have come from the same herd, duck, duck, goose. Anyone that's had kids will appreciate what that's about. And as we increase the amount of information, we had to increase the amount of information that these walking databases would have to carry with them. This animal here has 6. You can count 4 quite easily, but there's a couple of button tags buried in his ears as well. So either we had to do something different or grow bigger ears on our cattle, and along came our electronic ID systems. And the electronic ID systems were driven by Canadian Cattle Identification Agency. And certainly we understand what that was all about. The opportunity to trace back animals in Canada has been a huge success story from a trace back standpoint. There are many countries much larger than us that struggle dramatically in being able to accomplish this, but this is on the trace back element alone. And if we recall, the primary purpose of the CCIA system was for the containment and eradication of disease. But there's another new dimension that this opens it up to, animal management. And if you look at animal management, really, there are only 3 things that you can impact with a management system. And if we apply the compliance component on top of it, this should be a manageable process. I'm going to talk about these for a minute. Procurement and animal management. We currently cannot trace back to herd of origin based on the ID systems on ear tags, unless it's voluntarily provided by the supplier. And in a number of cases they are, and you'll see why in just a few moments. Our procurement systems, though, are based on all of the measures and all of the market forces that are in play at any point in time, which include certainly price dynamics, production performance of a particular type of animal, here heifer versus steer, a yearling versus calf, and a number of dynamics around that type. Genetics, potentially, breed type, certainly. We're looking at our marketing grid. Each of these animals have a propensity to result in a different type of carcass, and based on what the market signals are relative to a marketing grid, that shapes our purchasing practices. And when we can, and we have some herds that we have over 5 years of history, we're collecting herd history and using that for pricing dynamics on our feeder supplies. What we need to do is we need to dumb it down so we can make it work. Now, if there's any order buyers in this room, please keep your ears closed for just a minute. What we have to do is translate this into a mechanism that works in today's marketplace. So certainly we look at things like hide colors or face patterns. We'll talk about face patterns in a minute. But these are proxies that we give our buyers as they look at feeder cattle in the ring, as the vast majority of cattle sell in an auction environment. Oops. We undergo a much more technical process than is norm in the industry to establish our pricing. Any in the banking industry will immediately recognize the Monte Carlo modeling concept. It's a volatility and probability matrix that you put into pricing and performance around a number of parameters, and you develop projection models on your cattle. And so when cattle are offered in the marketplace, my cattle buyer will be running an analysis on all of the different cattle types, all of the projected performance of these cattle, all of the projected feed pricing matrices or potential pricing that's going to be out there, including contract prices, as well as the grid performance on these cattle. From that very convoluted and complicated algorithm, we identify which cattle represent the highest likelihood for success in the marketplace. This is underway continuously in our purchasing office. So this isn't a one-time-a-week or one-time-a-day process. This is continuous, and we also look at the futures market as it changes to see what the contract options are and whether that changes our preference for feeder cattle at any moment. We talked about ID and animal management. That was procurement. We'll talk management for a second. Intervention protocol really is health management and production management. As we look at implant strategies, as we look at feeding programs, and as we look at sorting programs, one would think that the answers, once you've conducted the research, is reasonably static or reasonably straightforward. But as we identify cattle coming into the feedlot, we measure 8 parameters. And each parameter goes into the algorithm, which then feeds our purchasing model or feeds our production system, in which animals are directed into one type of production system or another. The algorithms incorporate some measures that you'd expect, weight, hide color, but they incorporate some that you don't. Our research team at Western, one of the ladies from Sweden came to us, Sweden, that big feedlot country out there somewhere, came to us and said, we'd like to conduct a research trial. And we said, sure, that's your job. What do you got in mind? We'd like to look at the color of face patterns on cattle when they arrive at the feedlot to see if there are any correlations to production or carcass qualities. And we said, well, that's a little bit out there, but sure, I mean, as a scientist, you should be able to establish this. After conducting the information analysis on over 10,000 head, we came back with the correlations that allow us to plug into our algorithm as we signal to our buyers or as we determine what management system an animal goes into. The face pattern, the color face pattern on an animal is taken into consideration. If you walk into the processing barns at Western Feedlot, you'll hear codes and numbers being called out as the kids process cattle, and a data entry person on the other end plugging these in, and the algorithm automatically determines what the management strategy for that animal is and which gate opens up to which management group that animal will head. That's an example of immediate information utilization on receipt or as the animal arrives. So we talk about a total value proposition, and I mentioned that previously, and it's not a slam, but it's an observation on the research academia that tend to have single or double or triple perspectives when they conduct a research project because of the dynamics of the economics in a production environment is as diverse as it is, because the dynamics of cattle coming into a feed yard are as diverse as they are, and because the set of economics are as unique as they are between feed yards, the algorithm that's used to sort, identify, and manage cattle within an individual feed yard is very complex, but can be very profitable. We're now incorporating all of the carcass data that goes into it as well, and when it comes down to the perhaps the most significant factor as we conduct our research and move forward, it's about interaction. It's not about knowing an animal and knowing what implant to use, but knowing what the interaction of that animal with a specific technology is. We're looking now at beta agonists in a big way in different markets for beta agonists. For cattle have been fed different types of beta agonists. We're looking at different implant programs that exist. We're looking at different feeding regimes. We're looking at different genetics. And we're sitting back and identifying that it's the interaction of an individual animal based on his resources to those various stimuli that will identify for us the optimal animal. Is that significant? Well, in a yard that produces 200,000 animals a year, the lift so far is upwards of $40 a head. I don't know what 200,000 times 40 is. It's probably a big number, but that's what we're looking for, and we're pushing to get higher on that line. So, I mentioned the complexity that's involved in managing these animals. And as you look through the various questions and issues for an operation that's looking for this margin, this elusive margin we've talked about, we do believe with the application of science and good business management practices, there is still room for margin in the current industry. Not under a traditional production system, but one that uses information, processes it, and uses it in a strategic manner. This used to be the strategic model. Buy the class of cattle that gives you the option of generating more revenues. This now is more so the production model that allows us to target. And not necessarily are we looking for the highest price, but we're looking for the best margin within a cattle group.